Microloans, debts, and despair. How did European money end up fueling a debt crisis in Cambodia?
Follow the money.
This is the podcast of the European investigative newsroom, Follow the Money. I'm your host, Emma de Chassignier, and as always, I'm joined by Follow the Money reporter and my co-host, Alexander Fanta in Vienna. Hi, Alex.
Morning, Emma.
In this episode, we're looking at how European development banks are fueling a debt crisis in Cambodia. The idea behind microloans is simple. Give small loans to families with little money so they can start a business or buy equipment and lift themselves out of poverty. But on the ground in Cambodia, that promise has turned into something much darker. We're joined by reporter Leila Goldstein, who's based in Cambodia. Leila traveled across the country and spoke with families who had taken out loans. She revealed that microloans have pushed families into crushing debt and in some cases, even to suicide. Welcome, Leila. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Leila, you're from the US, but you're based in Cambodia now. What brought you there?
Yeah. So I had previously lived in Indonesia before I became a journalist. Then I went back to the US, and that's when I kind of built up my experience as a journalist, mostly working in public radio newsrooms in the US. But I always wanted to return to the region. So in 2023, I was hired at a regional outlet called the Southeast Asia Globe. They were headquartered in Phnom Penh. So that's what brought me here. And I'm really interested in any story that kind of has an international actor that affects local communities here in Cambodia or in Southeast Asia.
And in this story that you wrote for Follow the Money, a very central concept is microloans. What exactly are microloans?
Yeah, so a microloan, it's kind of what it sounds like. It's a relatively small loan. And the idea was to be able to offer credit to people who are living in poverty, especially to help people build up a small business. If you're living day by day on your earnings, say as a farmer, you wouldn't necessarily have the funds to be able to expand your planting, purchase more livestock and, improve your income. So industry advocates say that microloans reduce poverty and fuel the growth of these small businesses. So that's kind of, the advocate side say it reduces poverty. The critics say it's really fueled this over indebtedness, people taking out loans that they can't afford to pay back, or maybe that they don't understand the terms of. So predatory lending in Cambodia has resulted in those forced land sales and food insecurity.
And I think it's a very interesting contradiction because in a sense, microloans are seen as something very positive. And, Mohammed Yunus has been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his work doing microloans in Bangladesh. He's an entrepreneur and economist who started out giving these microloans. The idea was, in a sense, quite beautiful. You give a farmer a small loan and he'd, have a cup of chicken, he'd sell the eggs, he'd slowly pay off the profit. But that idea kind of has evolved and morphed and, become, I think, a lot more like conventional lending over the years.
And specifically in Cambodia, microloans have even led to people taking their own lives because they couldn't pay back their loans. And to explore that, you traveled all across the country and you met with different families of people who had, in fact, died by suicide linked to these loans. One of the people you met was the family of Ban O. What did they tell you?
Yeah. First, I do want to credit that I worked on this story with Cambodian journalist Sothyroth Phon. So, she speaks Khmer. Obviously, she's a Cambodian journalist, and she was doing the interviews. So when we were able to speak with Bun O's daughters and husband about Bun O's suicide, and she was a cassava and pig farmer, and she had taken out about 9,000 euros from Hatta Bank, which is one of the biggest banks in Cambodia. And she took out those loans in 2022. About a year later, she was really struggling to pay the monthly payments. And her family told us that the credit officer was coming often and was harassing and threatening her. And in January 2024, a credit officer delivered a letter to her home. And the letter, which we reviewed, said that she needed to come to the bank for a meeting, and if she didn't show up, they would take legal action. And the next morning, she was found dead, and her death was designated as suicide in the police report, which we also reviewed. Talking to the family, it was incredibly emotional to hear the story, to hear their experience. Her daughters, pleaded with loan firms in the interview, saying they shouldn't extort people for these loan payments.
But you found, in fact, that this story is not a one-off. This was actually an example of something that happens quite often in Cambodia. What made you realize that this wasn't a one-off?
Yeah, for sure. We documented 5 cases of suicides or attempted suicides that where debt or the predatory lending may have played a role. But we also talked to additional sources. In some ways, suicide is a very extreme result of predatory lending. But we talked to other people who, experienced threats and intimidation by loan officers, encouraging them to sell their land or belongings. Debt-linked suicides might be the one extreme end result, but we certainly spoke to other people that experience the, other harms, maybe mental health issues, maybe not being able to sleep, maybe, getting children to work and leave school because they wanted to pay back the debt. And then also we kind of narrowed the scope of our story because Follow the Money is European focused. We narrowed, the stories that we included in the article had to be from loan firms that had a bunch of investment from European development banks.
Yeah, and that's a very important aspect to your story as well, right? The fact that European governments and institutions support this. How does their involvement work?
You're right. European government agencies or development banks have invested hundreds of millions of dollars into Cambodian loan firms. They are investing in these microfinance companies in developing countries. The microfinance companies then give out loans to individuals, and then they make profits off the interests of those loans. Sometimes they might, acquire the land because the land was used as collateral. So then those loan firms end up becoming, very profitable. And then the European investment firm that loaned them money is making money off of that loan. And those banks make profits off those investments. Those development banks are making profits.
What you also write is that in general in Cambodia, it's actually very common to have quite large debts. You write that the average loan in Cambodia is worth more than 4 times the median per capita income. How is that? Where does that come from? Why is Cambodia a country with so many debts?
Yeah, it has to do with the fact that, microfinance loans have become so popular here. It's extremely profitable. Cambodia is a developing country, so it can attract those kind of investments of, development agencies or impact investment companies wanting to invest in a developing country, a country with, high poverty. It also has to do with probably lack of government regulation. It has the highest debt per capita. It has the highest microfinance debt per capita ratio in the world.
It's essentially also quite poor country where a lot of people are struggling to make a living, right? And it's like the microfinance is this kind of hand out of poverty, but it sometimes kind of pushes people back into poverty, isn't it?
Yeah, and it relies on the idea that people actually are going to be able to make profits to pay back the loans when there's a lot of issues with farmers here being able to make enough money. There's a lot of people who are migrating out of Cambodia to be able to send money back to their family who is farming in Cambodia. It also relies on people understanding the terms of their loan and, making a sound financial decision. If you don't understand the terms of your loan, if you don't have financial literacy, and you have people coming to your small village and telling you this is, going to help you, then that doesn't really set you up for success. And it might, appear to be the only possibility to get out of a financial hard spot.
This is a kind of predatory form of lending. There's another term which is loan shark. Somebody who gives out kind of loans with too high interest, which puts a lot of pressure on the person borrowing the money. But so where's the line where you say lending becomes predatory and evil?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there are some, academic definitions. I don't know if I'm the one to say, but, some of the examples of the people we spoke with, a major aspect is a lot of these people are illiterate. They come from indigenous communities where they either are not literate in any language, but especially in Khmer, which is the national language, that they might not even speak Khmer. And then their loan documents are written in Khmer. So if you can't understand the loan document, and there's not adequate, explanation provided, that can be a form of predatory lending if they don't understand the terms of the documents that they signed and are now have a commitment to pay back. So yeah, actual literacy and then also financial literacy. If a loan being extremely high interest rate, if it's for an amount that the person would couldn't really demonstrate that they would be able to pay off based on, their past income and past earnings from their sales. If, you can kind of predict whether or not someone will be able to pay back that loan. And then there's just the kind of the harassment aspect. If someone's coming to your house saying you should sell your daughter, you should, take your children out of school, you should sell your only means of transportation, so that you could pay, or you should go and take out another loan from a private lender. The whole idea of the microfinance loan is that they're better than these private lenders. But if then the loan officers are going out and saying, hey, go get a loan from your neighbor so you can pay me back, then that's an example of something predatory.
And I think your story mentions a figure like 18% interest in 1 year, which is not a credit rate anyone in Europe would use on their mortgage for their buying a house or something like that. So it's really quite steep, and a lot of these people taking out these kind of loans in Cambodia are basically one crop failure away from defaulting on their debt. And is that
And it's like, well, when it's such a widespread issue that's all across the country, when there is tons of documentation of predatory, intimidation tactics, people coming and, advertising, going into, small villages and encouraging people, even understanding kind of the dynamic of, someone maybe who hasn't interacted with an organization that would make a legal threat that would say, hey, if we will take legal action. In the case of one of the stories in my story, we'll take legal action. People, that's different than if I received that letter. I might know, I don't have to worry about that, or I could get legal representation. So I'm a little cautious on the, focus on, individual people need to make good financial choices when it's such a systemic issue. I don't think that should be the focus.
I think it's also, it bears reminding, 2 decades back, there was a global financial crisis sparked off by subprime lending in the US, which was essentially, kind of banks and lenders giving money to people who really couldn't afford to buy a house. And then, when the market turned suddenly bad, everyone, not everyone, but like obviously, millions of people defaulted on their debt, and the banks had a lot of bad loans, too much to take on. So, at what point, is it a systemic thing? It's not really, obviously people maybe had a bad time, but there's an element of where it's the system that it's at fault, not the individual making the decision, right?
For sure.
And what you also document is that there have, like, these are issues that have been known for quite a few years, and there have been some improvements. What are some of the improvements that have been made in recent years?
For sure. Yeah, there's been a lot of local and international press about issues in Cambodia with microfinance loans. So it's not like it's a never been covered topic. But in 2023, there was an article in The Guardian that documented a series of suicides and attempted suicides where family members or the survivor said that their microfinance debt or predatory lending practices contributed to the suicide. So part of that story focused on how certain loan firms had received these industry certifications. So the rating firms evaluate the policies of a lender, and then they give them a rating saying whether they meet a gold standard or they meet the silver standard. And then that's something that they can put on their website and say, we have a gold certification. So that was part of that article. And the organization that had, taken over the certification framework, they responded to the findings of the article and they said, we're going to request that these firms get their certifications placed under review. So that seemed like a good, impact journalism result, Hey, we pointed out, look at these horrific situations that these firms with the gold star are linked to. And so now they're going to have their certifications reviewed. So that seemed like a win. But then when I checked like a year later, it seemed like most of them were renewed. Some of them had improved from like silver to gold. So I wanted to look into, kind of what happened with that.
So did things actually improve?
So before the Guardian's reporting, there was this organization, it's called Cerise SPTF, and they're actually a group of European and US nonprofits. And they had taken over this certification framework in 2021. So they had previously evaluated and monitored rating agencies. They decided, is this rating agency, following our guidelines? They are qualified to give out the certifications. After the Guardian's article, they decided to do away with that system. And in one of their emails to me, they did say one of the factors was liability. The Guardian's reporting was highlighting how these firms that had the certifications still were linked to these horrific cases. And so afterwards, they decided to do away with that oversight. So currently, there's no oversight of any organization can give out a certification. There's no monitoring of their methodologies. There's no monitoring of their conflicts of interest or the qualifications of their auditors. I actually asked in an interview with Cerise SPTF representative, could I today open Leila's ratings agency and give out certifications? And the answer was yes. Now, he did say, well, why would a firm hire you? You don't have the track record or expertise. Sure. But the fact that my brand new rating agency could give out certifications really does call into question how meaningful are the certifications.
That's shocking. It's shocking. Also, just to follow up on that quickly, I think it's also really interesting that, these European development banks give money to the lenders and then, kind of seem to be completely turning a blind eye to some of these problems. Do you know if there's been any institutional follow-up within the development agencies and banks that give that money?
Yeah. So, I think, what I really wanted to highlight in this story in terms of the European development banks is that a lot of them used these certifications as part of their due diligence method. And they would put it on their website. We only invest in firms with gold level certifications, or we consider the certifications, or this is part of, what we use to evaluate. Or they would put it with, we made this investment, and then they'd put it on the page. They'd highlight, they got this certification. So they get kind of a good PR aspect from these certifications. And then meanwhile, they are also the ones investing in Cerise SPTF. So much of Cerise SPTF's own funding is donor funding from European development agencies.
That's ironic.
Yeah, because for the issues that you've described, who would you say is actually ultimately to blame here?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I am the one to pick out, a particular actor that's to blame. I think, for this story, I did choose to focus on the vast amounts of European dollars that are being put into the industry. Some of these agencies have stopped investing, but they still have current investments. So even if they said we're not going to do future investments and they announced that a couple years ago, they still have investments and they're still going to get profits from those investments. And I think they should still be accountable for the harms, even if they've decided not to invest in the future.
So who's the one benefiting from, like, in theory, the people that should benefit from microloans are people that are being lifted out of poverty because of microloans. Well, I think we've seen that in many cases, that's not actually the case. But is there someone else that's actually benefiting from this microloan system the way it is right now?
Yeah, I mean, European development banks, are making those profits. And then even the ones that are, kind of trying to move away from the loan firms in Cambodia, they're moving away by selling off their shares in these firms to private companies. So they're making, or
Another
at least they're getting some benefit from that. So, even by getting out of the industry, there's still a benefit.
To zoom out a little bit, the issues you're describing, they are not specific to Cambodia, are they?
Definitely not. Debt-linked suicides have been documented in India. There's been a lot of reporting on issues with microfinance there. Predatory lending practices have been documented in Kenya and in Mexico. And then right now, I was looking at other loan firms, on that lower level, the actual loan firms in Bolivia, in Tunisia, and Kenya have, highlight these certifications on their websites as a way to build trust with the potential borrowers in, say, Bolivia, and then also with the investors, like the European development agencies. And so I think that if you're doing that, then you are deserving of scrutiny, you are deserving of sunlight on your actions, and they should be transparent for people to, see and make their own judgments.
That's what your reporting contributed to, I hope.
Yeah, I hope so too.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Leila. That's where we'll leave it for today's episode. And Alex and I will be back soon for another episode. Thank you, Leila.
Thank you so much for having me.
You've listened to the podcast of Follow the Money. Our watchdog journalism is funded by our members. Subscribe and support European investigative journalism.